From the National Catholic Register, this is Register Radio, bringing light and clarity to the news and topics that affect your life.
Voting in any election is a right, but it also brings responsibilities. Catholics voting in elections are especially obligated to prepare fully, and that means forming our consciences. But what are some of the key issues? Are some issues more important than others? This week on Register Radio, I'll talk with EWTN's Vice President for Theology, Colin Donovan, on forming your conscience properly before you vote. And then, Register contributor Dr. Anthony Lilles tells us about the newly declared saint, Elizabeth of the Trinity. Welcome again to Register Radio. I'm Matthew Bunson, a senior editor for the National Catholic Register, senior contributor for EWTN, and co-host of Register Radio. I'm filling in as host for Register Editor-in-Chief Jeanette DeMello, who's away on maternity leave. Jeanette sends her thanks for the prayers. And thank you so much for joining me. Much is made in every election cycle about what matters most to voters. Polls give us some idea, but they often miss the point as to what are or should be key foundational issues confronting America. Politics is called the art of the possible, or the fruit of negotiation. But are some topics so important that they're deemed non-negotiable? This is important when deciding on where to put our vote. What is negotiable and non-negotiable for Catholics, and what does that mean for how we form our consciences? To shed a little light on all of this, I'm joined by Colin Donovan. He's Vice President for Theology at EWTN and host of the Friday edition of Open Line on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network. He moderates as well the EWTN Theology Roundtable, a monthly series on EWTN radio and television. Colin, welcome.
Well, good to be with you, Matthew.
Well, you recently contributed an important commentary to the National Catholic Register on the issue of negotiables and non-negotiables and that somewhat imposing term proportionality. For those who may not be familiar with those kinds of terms, first let's start with what are non-negotiables from a Catholic standpoint.
Sure. The moral tradition, and here people have to remember that the Church has a long common theology on these subjects, even when the average Catholic is not aware of it. And popes generally are speaking regarding that when they address moral issues, and they may be specifying it and delineating it or advancing it in some way. But the expression of this particular term of non-negotiable goes to Pope Benedict, who both as a prefect for the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith and writing to the U.S. bishops in 2004, spoke of a certain distinction between those things which involve goods which are not a matter of simply optional opinions, which would keep a person from going to communion, such as the view and support for abortion, euthanasia on the one hand, and other issues such as how capital punishment and when it should be applied, how the just war theory is applied to concrete cases. Those things people can disagree about, and so you can't weight them separately, and he sort of left it there. Now, in reality, the tradition had already spoken of this. You can look at moral theology authors, of which there are dozens, that were the standard references in various languages throughout the Church, and they would speak of the issues of morality, freedom, and religion as being very central and key, especially in democratic countries in voting. In 2006, speaking to parliamentarians from the European Parliament, then Pope Benedict went even a little bit and got a little bit clearer on this whole subject, because he explicitly used this term non-negotiable in saying that in the Catholic Church's view, the focus of her interventions in the public arena, or the public square, as we say usually in our country, is the protection and promotion of the dignity of the person. And he tied three areas to that as being central: protection of life in all its stages from the first moment of conception until natural death, and recognition and promotion of the natural structure of the family as a union between a man and a woman based on marriage, and its defense from attempts to make it juridically equivalent to radically different forms of union. And finally, the protection of the right of parents to educate their children, which is a conscience right within the broader right of religious freedom, and within, obviously, a a broader natural right of conscience. And so he defines these as non-negotiables, which makes other issues like capital punishment, war and peace, health care, economics, and so on negotiable. If those are non-negotiable, those other things which are complex, involve multiple principles and circumstances, are necessarily negotiable among politicians about what will work in their society, how to the means to use to achieve it, and so on.
Mm-hmm. But this goes just beyond Catholics. We're talking about the common good and the dignity of the human person.
That's right. And so if you look at the Catechism of the Catholic Church, for example, you will find that among the things listed as part of the common good, the first category involves life and freedom and so on. And so that the common good is composed of those things which all people hold in common. The protection of life is obviously the most basic good and right of the human being. And so that has to be the foundation, as it were. Next upon that, human beings come together in marriage for the begetting of children, the raising of children, so that they will fit in and mature properly, humanly, morally, socially, and so on, and fit into the society. So the life of the society depends upon marriage and family life. And then finally, there is religious freedom, this intangible, transcendent thing inside of us that goes beyond and gives reason and understanding to the broader world and even the universe, and in many cases comes to the comprehension of God himself. And so that has to be protected because, again, one's thoughts and acting in accordance with one's moral principles is also essential to other people. Now, the Church goes on to talk about goods such as just wages and health care and so on and so forth. But unless you have life, unless you have a solid family, unless you have freedom of conscience, especially in the religious moral dimension, the other rights are also deprecated. And you can have health care, but health care with abortion, for example, is no right at all. Marriage which depreciates natural marriage from which children come and from which society is built is not a right at all. So in the negotiables, you can find the possibility of both advancing the greater common goods, the central ones, the essential ones, or you can find them deprecated and suppressed in favor of purely what I'm calling a basket of negotiable things that we'd all like to have these particular things.
Yeah. Well, you're listening to Register Radio here on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network. I'm Matthew Bunson, Senior Editor for the Register and Senior Contributor for EWTN, talking with Colin Donovan, Vice President of Theology for EWTN, about the negotiables and non-negotiables when it comes to voting. Well, Colin, you've hit on something that's kind of important when we're discussing negotiables, because one of the things that you often hear is that people say, well, aren't really issues equal? Shouldn't we weigh everything, especially if we're talking about a politician who supports abortion but wants to do so many other good things?
That's true, and I find especially among Catholics familiar with the body of what popes and others have written will often point to that 2004 letter that of Cardinal Ratzinger, which I referred to earlier, in which he did say that there can be a proportionate reason to vote for a candidate, for example, on who is maybe not solid on the life issue, for example. So to vote for a pro-choice candidate, there can be a proportionate reason for doing that. And you have to ask yourself, well, what could be proportionate for that? Was, for instance, if you talk about the pursuit of economic goods, is the pursuit of economic goods for a whole society justifying, say, taking out the economic problems in society, the economic inconveniences in society, or the economic inconveniences in the life of individuals in the society? And abortion is such a thing that does that. So when you're comparing the two, it's not possible to say with a broad stroke that the economy, healthcare, and everything else is the equivalent of the non-negotiables. There is no proportion. How many lives is it safe to, or is it morally legitimate to kill to advance those goods? And I think the answer to that is zero. There are no lives that is proportionally good. And some would even say, well, but if the health care is not good, people will die. There's an indirect difference between the non-provision of something, in which multiple circumstances, people die because they're distant from their doctors, because they don't go into the doctors soon enough, because they don't get this exactly when they need it, or it's simply a condition that is insolvable medically. There are all kinds of reasons people die. In abortion, in euthanasia, in embryonic stem cell research, there is one reason people die: the malicious will of another human being who says one life is more important than another. So yes, people can die from inadequate health care, from poverty and other things. But the reality is a society that embraces the malice of abortion, euthanasia, and so on and so forth is actually in a graver moral state than a person who simply, through multiple kinds of impossibilities, including the failures of government to provide basic health care, then die. Nobody wills that, although there can be malice and so on and fault involved. But in abortion, in euthanasia, in the depreciation of heterosexual marriage and the children that come from it, those can be willed things by government. In fact, they are being willed by some governments today.
So you can appreciate exactly why those are non-negotiable.
Exactly.
Very briefly, in the time we have left, where can people go for more information about all of this?
Well, on EWTN's website, EWTN.com/vote, slant again. And when you do that, you will see that we have taken each of the different areas: degrees of moral cooperation, conscience, prudence, the voting morality regarding the voting specifically, and all of these things, and they can dig down into those topics on the website. It may take a little work, but if some element of that confuses you, please do dig down. You'll find papal quotes and other quotes on negotiables versus non-negotiables, and on each of these topics of Catholic moral theology that I've mentioned.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Colin. We really appreciate your coming on to discuss a lot of these topics because they can be such the source of confusion.
Well, I'm very happy to do that, Matthew.
Well, when we come back, delightful news coming from the Vatican just recently when Pope Francis canonized 7 new saints. One of them is a French mystic and a nun contemporary of St. Therese of Lisieux. Her name is St. Elizabeth of the Trinity, and we're going to talk with Dr. Anthony Lilles about her. When we come back, this is Register Radio on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network. More when we return.
Bishop Robert Barron talks about the importance of the National Catholic Register.
The Register delivers something which is extremely important because you won't get it from the mainstream media, namely the Catholic context and perspective. Sometimes the mainstream media will pretend, they don't have a perspective. They're just giving the news neutrally. Well, no one does that. Everyone's got a perspective. What they often bring is a sort of secularist ideology. The National Catholic Register brings a robustly Catholic take on the world, and that's indispensably important.
For a free 6-issue trial of the National Catholic Register, go to ncregister.com and click on the 6 free issue banner or call 800-421-3230 for your 6 free issues. And as you await your first issue, enjoy our online content.
Let's return to Register Radio on EWTN.
And welcome back to Register Radio. I'm Matthew Bunson, Senior Editor for the National Catholic Register and Senior Contributor for EWTN. Pope Francis recently declared 7 new saints for the Universal Church, including a French nun and mystic who died in 1906 and was actually a contemporary in France of the beloved St. Therese of Lisieux, the Little Flower. I'm talking about St. Elizabeth of the Trinity. To learn more about this new saint, I'm joined by Dr. Anthony Lilles, a founding faculty member of St. John Vianney Theological Seminary in Denver and now academic dean for St. John's Seminary in Camarillo, California. He holds a doctorate from the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas in Rome and his dissertation research included St. Elizabeth of the Trinity. Anthony, welcome.
It's great to be part of your show this morning. Thanks for having me.
Well, it's a rare occasion that you're able to talk to somebody who actually focused a dissertation on a saint. So I'm really excited to be able to talk to you about Elizabeth of the Trinity. What first drew you to her? How did you first come into contact with her?
When I was an undergraduate at the Franciscan University of Steubenville, there was a course on John Paul II taught by Dr. Mark Miravalli. And in that course, it was at the same time as her beatification. And during the beatification, John Paul II preached that the four most influential French mystics in his life included Elizabeth of the Trinity. He also listed Therese of Lisieux and Charles de Foucauld. I can't remember the fourth one. And but for whatever reason, I heard that, and I thought, that is interesting. I wonder what that means. And I found a copy of her writings, and I began to read, and I found myself drawn to prayer as an undergraduate. And that began my reading of Blessed Elizabeth, well, now Saint Elizabeth. It was going to take me a while to change that. Yeah. Saint Elizabeth of the Trinity.
It's like a promotion.
Yeah. When I went to school in Rome at the Angelicum, as I began to think about a doctoral topic, I thought about how much her writings had helped me and helped friends of mine go into deep prayer, and it seemed like there was something there worth exploring, and so that's how my doctoral project got begun.
Well, in a piece that you wrote for the National Catholic Register on this new saint, you made an interesting observation that this was something of a wild child, that she dealt with anger issues, and then came her first communion. It strikes me as a rather extraordinary story.
Yes. It doesn't happen for all of us, but sometimes children receive very, very special graces. I think every child receives very special graces at their first communion, but sometimes those graces end up changing someone's whole life, and this is what happened for Elizabeth. As you said, she had a pretty fiery temper. Her parents, her mom had been working with it. Her father had died when she was younger, and the priest of the parish had also been working with her in confession. But when she received communion, witnesses say they saw her during her Thanksgiving pulled into deep prayer. They said there was something beautiful that had happened, and they were going to go to the party afterwards. That they have cake and things afterwards for children, and she said, I'm no longer hungry. Jesus had fed me, and the witnesses said she just wanted to stay there and pray and never leave. And from that time forward, we find descriptions in her writing about her saying things like, I love to go within and search for Jesus hidden within me. I love to seek him in those places where he's especially hard to find. And with that kind of resolve and devotion, her life of contemplative or mental prayer made rapid advancement.
Now, she's called Elizabeth of the Trinity. Talk about that as part of her life and also her particular spirituality.
Pope Leo XIII had written an encyclical that called the Church to rediscover the gift of the Holy Spirit and the indwelling of the Trinity. He had written it just around the time that she entered, and so that's one of the reasons why she was given that. And she chose to make that something of the mission of her life. She wrote about, we have references to the divine persons before she entered Carmel, but after she entered Carmel and received that name, references to the persons of the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, you just find it explodes in her writings. And this will become one of her most important contributions to the Church. she's helped a lot of contemplatives rediscover devotion to the persons of the Trinity in their contemplative prayer.
Well, you're listening to Register Radio here on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network. I'm Matthew Bunson, Senior Editor for National Catholic Register and Senior Contributor for EWTN. And I'm talking with Dr. Anthony Lilles about one of the Church's newest saints, St. Elizabeth of the Trinity. So beyond the Trinity, Doctor, what are some of the features of her mysticism?
She draws from a number of sources. What struck me when I first read her was her use of the Scriptures. St. John and St. Paul permeate her writings, especially in the last 2 years of her life. And all her major writings come from that section towards the end of her life. And it's interesting to note this because she didn't have a Bible. All she had was a little manual that listed atomized verses. Out of context, but she would read those and commit them to memory, and take them into prayer. And what's most fascinating is how deeply she penetrates the actual meaning of the text and uses that to advance a spiritual doctrine about mental prayer and following Christ. That is coherent throughout her whole corpus, and so it's a great gift. So the Scriptures are there, and the Carmelite mystics at the time, Teresa, Saint Teresa of Avila, Saint John of the Cross, and Saint Therese of Lisieux were not called doctors of the Church, and yet Saint Elizabeth had read their writings, knew their writings by heart, and their writings permeate everything she's written. You find constant references to their rich theologies. And then finally, the medieval mystics, Angela di Foligno, Ruysbrock, and Catherine of Siena are also amply quoted by her.
So she clearly stands in the great tradition of mystics in the life of the Church.
I believe so. I've had the opportunity to interview contemplative religious, both in this country but also Europe. And as I mentioned before, her command of those sources, she brings them together like a mosaic in apps. Father Conrad de Meester uses that language. It really has helped a lot of contemplatives be drawn into prayer, be drawn to the loving presence of the Father, and it has also opened their hearts up to a devotion to the Holy Trinity, and what theologians call the circumcision of love that is in the Trinity. When we receive the gift of the Holy Spirit, that life of love that is from all eternity, before time began, that life of love is kind of, as it were, exploding in our hearts. And the more we are open to it, the more we receive it, the more wonderful things we make space for God to do in our lives.
Yeah. Is there any chance that she might be declared a doctor of the Church based on all of her writings and sort of based on her contemporary, Therese?
I'm quite certain that someday she will be considered a doctor of the Church. The Carthusian prior of both the Grand Chartreuse, but also the Charterhouse in Vermont, both related to me that her writings have done more to impact devotion to the persons of the Trinity than all the other writings of the Church combined since the time of Leo XIII. And so she's had a huge impact. It's hidden, though. These graces of devotion are hidden, and so they're difficult to discern. But I think she's done something for the Church in our time. We reawakened a sense of the importance of contemplative prayer because she's able to bring us back to this principal doctrine of our faith, the doctrine of the Holy Trinity.
Mm-hmm. And one of the questions I know that even I've been asked about her is, did she know Therese of Lisieux, who, of course, lived around the same time that she did?
She knew Therese only through her writings. Therese died when Elizabeth was 17 years old, and as you know, Therese died very young. The circular letter that was sent to all the Carmels was sent to Dijon, and the prioress of Dijon knew that Elizabeth was considering a vocation, felt called to Carmel, and so she asked Therese to read the circular letter. That circular letter, we know it today as the story of a soul.
Yeah.
Elizabeth would have been one of the first people to read it, and it confirmed her vocation. After that, her whole passion was to try to get into Carmel.
Mm-hmm. Well, where can people find you, and especially if they'd like to know a lot more about this remarkable new saint?
I write for spiritualdirection.com, and I also have my own blog at beginningtopray.com. I'm hoping to get something out myself on St. Elizabeth of the Trinity. In the meantime, I would highly recommend a work by Sister Giovanna della Croce called A Life of Praise to God. It's a brilliant work.
Mm-hmm. Well, Anthony, I'm very grateful that you could make the time to join me today. It's important for all of us to know more about new saints, isn't it?
Oh, I think so. They're part of the signs of the time. You know, when the Holy Spirit moves the church to canonize someone, it's usually because that person has something extremely important for us today. And I think that's the case with Elizabeth of the Trinity.
Well, thanks so much again. Look forward to having you on.
Thank you, Matthew. Have a good day.
Well, that concludes today's Register Radio here on EWTN. For much more on the Register's election coverage, please go to ncregister.com and click on our special 2016 election button. You'll find expert reporting on election news and issues. For now, though, for my producer, Jeff Burson, I am Matthew Bunson. Until next week, God bless.
For more information about the National Catholic Register and about Register Radio, go to ncregister.com. Podcasts of Register Radio are posted on ncregister.com and on EWTN.com. Join us next week at this time for Register Radio on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.